Good morning, church. Happy summer. Super glad you guys are all here, and hopefully you get to travel at some point, take a vacation, get a break. Such a cool Sunday, man. 3 baptisms, just watching God move in people's hearts and lives, and we're just praying that'll continue to be true. As in 3 Sundays, as Danielle just stressed, we're gonna do just a baptism celebration. Anybody who's thinking about it, I would never encourage you to wait 2 weeks if you're ready, but on that day, anybody who wants to, anybody who wants to and hasn't done it before, we'll get to that later. So we'll be asking you to respond. So we are in the book of Luke. We've been walking through this for 2 years. And what we're gonna do for the next 3 weeks is we're gonna look at one chapter, Luke 15. It's gonna be like looking at a diamond. And when you look at the diamond, it's kind of like, oh, look at that angle. Oh, I didn't see that sparkle. Oh, look at that thing. So that's what this is gonna be like. So don't be surprised if you hear similar things for the next 3 weeks and then if you learn something new. So keep coming back and as we pursue to understand the heart of our Father. What I find fascinating about Luke 15 is it follows Luke 14. Nobody thinks that's interesting except for me, huh? If you were here last week, we know we ended Luke 14 with some radical statements by Jesus. In case you weren't here, here's what Jesus said. He says something to the effect of, if you want to follow me, you must be willing to hate your father, your mother, your children, your spouse, even your own life. And anybody who wants to follow me must take up their own cross. Anybody unwilling to do these is not really fit to be my disciple. And you hear that and you think, Jesus, this is not how you grow a church. This is like the exact opposite of how you got to follow it. But that comes right before Luke 15. See, what I love about those two things, if you're just reading through the book itself, through Luke, you see in Luke 14, Jesus makes these radically hard statements. And then in Luke 15, he tells you a story that reveals the love of God. And what that does is it helps you understand the heart of God, that in essence, God is saying, what I am offering is way better than what anybody else has to offer. Trust me, come to me, and you will find all that you need. Well, years ago, it's been said, C.S. Lewis, if you don't know, C.S. Lewis wrote Chronicles of Narnia. C.S. Lewis was at a conference, and the conference was on comparable religions. And he walks into a room, and they're debating what sets Christianity apart from other religions. And in that conversation, they're talking about, the incarnation, when God took on flesh, became man. Well, lots of religions have stories of divinity becoming man, and you can already see the answer on the slide. It steals a little bit of my thunder. But they're talking about all these different things, like miracles. Lots of religions have miracles. But what sets Christianity apart from other religions, C.S. Lewis goes, well, this is easy. It's grace. Grace. In every other major world religion, it's about what you do that makes you right with God. But Jesus defined right with God as what Jesus did, what's already been done. One of my professors in Bible college, a guy named Jack Cottrell, Dr. Jack Cottrell, he says this: grace is the most extreme expression of God's love when it comes face to face with sin. Grace is God's willingness and desire to forgive and accept the sinner in spite of his sin, to give the sinner the very opposite of what he deserves. So now let's get into Luke 15 and just see. So here's what I find fascinating. Jesus never defines grace. All he does is use the word and then tell us stories and then live a life that illustrates what grace looks like. Luke 15:1. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Then Jesus told them this parable. A few things to note real quick. We don't know exactly who's gathering around Jesus. Apparently, their sin is notorious enough that we can label them sinners. And what that means is this other group that's referenced here, these Pharisees and these teachers of the law, they are looking at the people that Jesus is associating with, and they're saying, how dare you hang out with people like them? And here's the thing, you have a them category. You have a group of people that you think to yourself, if Jesus were walking the earth today, he would associate with me over them any day of the week. And it might be a certain wealth status. It might be a certain coolness status. It might be a certain sin struggle. It might be a certain, perhaps you think a certain nationality that God was just like, yeah, they would be the second one. Maybe he'd get to them sooner or later after he spent time with me. And so what Jesus is about to do is he's about to tell a parable. Notice that. It says this parable. What we see in Luke 15 is there are 3 stories in a row, and there are 4 total characters in those stories, characters that are the focus of the story. But he says, this parable, meaning all of these characters in all of these stories are really intended to communicate one point. So that makes us ask the question, then what is happening here? Who is Jesus addressing, and why is he addressing them? So let's get into the first story. Luke 15:4. Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? As Jesus would go on, he tells more of the story, but in essence, you got a shepherd, right? We oftentimes see in the Bible that God is a shepherd. Jesus refers to himself as the good shepherd. We talked about that a few weeks ago. And now, look, you got a shepherd. He's got 100 sheep, and one of them wanders away. Wouldn't a good shepherd leave the 99 together and go find the one? Now, if you were sitting there counting your money and you're going, well, I have $999,000 and then I have these $1,000, right? Like, should I protect my $999,000 or should I go after this one? Now, we go, that's bad math. Look, sometimes sheep wander away. It is what it is. What I ought to do is put all my money and my time and my effort into these 99 because this is more valuable. And what Jesus is trying to communicate and telling the story the way he is, it's not that one is more valuable than the other, it's just that they are all valuable. He doesn't have the ability to say, this one doesn't matter anymore. I must go get it. So as Jesus tells the story, the shepherd goes off, he finds the sheep in the far country, he grabs the sheep, places it on his shoulders, carries it back home, and everybody throws a party. There's a big celebration. In fact, he says, and all of heaven, in the same way, all of heaven will rejoice over just one sinner who repents. Story number 2. Or suppose a woman who has 10 silver coins and she loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? It's hard for us to understand this because when we think of coins, most likely, though some of you might have some sort of silver dollar or gold dollar, most likely the biggest coin we're thinking of is a quarter. And you think to yourself, I lose those in my couch all the time. Like, what is the big deal? Well, first of all, we're talking 2,000 years ago, first century Palestine. We are talking about a completely different culture and context. There's also reasons to believe that there are some connections between what a widow would have and what she would receive from a husband who took care of her. It's possible, since this woman has no other family members specifically listed in the story, she's a widow. These are her only 10 coins. This is the only 10 she's got. And it's possible that what we're seeing then is this idea in her head of not only is this extremely financially valuable, there could be an emotional connection to her husband that's passed. Not only makes the story that much stronger and more powerful as we're reading it, as Jesus is trying to help us understand why. So this woman, when she's lost her coin, she goes on a search. She drops everything else. Afternoon tea, whatever she had planned, it's all on hold at the minute. There is nothing more important than finding this coin. And she grabs a lamp, she searches high and low. She looks under the couch, under the table, in the bed, in the old clothes, everywhere until she finds it. And she gathers everybody together, another big party. It's gonna be great. And all of heaven will rejoice over just one sinner who repents and is found. Now, if these 3 stories have overlap, and so far we see they do, then we should be asking the question, what are the similarities between the stories that God wants us to extrapolate as we're listening to them? One thing I think you ought to be paying attention to is the intensifying nature of percentages. There's a big word, right? Big phrase, intensifying nature of percentages. So you get 1% in the first story, you get 10% in the second story. What's the percent going to be in the third story? Most of you have heard the story of the prodigal son, right? I like to listen to and watch sports. This analogy of the prodigal returning is so common as you listen to sportscasters talk about different things, and they'll say things like, the prodigal son has returned. I know when I say the name LeBron James in Indiana, it does not get the response I get when I go to Ohio and say it. But if you go to Ohio, when LeBron left Cleveland, went to Miami, and came back, do you know how many times you heard the prodigal has returned? So what happens is we have this visual image in our mind that a prodigal is a son who left and came back. The problem is, Luke 15:11, it says this, Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. And the reason is, what you're going to find is he doesn't just have 1 son who's lost, he has 2 sons who are lost. And the percentages just went from 1% to 10% to 100%. Well, here's how the story goes. I'll summarize a lot. Again, we'll look deeper over the next 2 weeks. But story number 1, we have a son. The son comes to the father, and the son demands his inheritance. You don't have to answer out loud, but when do you receive your inheritance? When your parents are dead. There are exceptions to the rule, perhaps, that what happens is when your parents get really sick and they can no longer take care of themselves, they might come to you and say, you're responsible for the inheritance while I'm living out my life and whatever, and you're gonna be the overseer of everything. But this older son, what he does is he goes to his dad and says, Dad, I want my inheritance now. Dad is healthy, he's got many years of life left. In essence, what the son has done, the way Jesus is telling the story, is he's demanded his dad's life. Now, in order for the dad to do that, the dad has to take upon himself the shame and the public pain of going and selling the land. You ever watch the news? You ever hear about the war going on in Israel right now? What is it they're fighting about? Land. That's what they've been fighting about for thousands and thousands of years. So this father has to go into the community and say, I'm gonna sell the lower 40 in order to give my son his inheritance. And the rest of the community is gonna go, what? You're an idiot. What dad sells the land because son wants to rebel and slap you in the face? You ought to look at him, take that left hand right across his face, say, get out of here, you're no son of mine anymore. That's what any good Middle Eastern dad would have done. But this dad takes the public shame of embarrassing himself and lets his younger son have the inheritance. And as the story goes, the son goes off in the far country and he wastes the money on wild living. We'll talk more about that next week. But he spends the money. He's living it up. He's living the good life. And then as he starts to run out of resources, things take a turn for the worse. There's a terrible, terrible famine in the land, and no longer can he survive. So he gets a job. But as the story goes, where he gets a job is with a pig farmer. Now, you may not know anything about Jewish culture, but have you ever been on a long-term overseas trip and you were offered the kosher meal? Well, pork would not have been on the diet. Pork was considered unclean. So the fact that Jesus tells a story that he went to work for a pig farmer tells you he was so desperate he couldn't get a job with any good, respecting person. And why is that? He shamed the family name. Nobody is gonna give this guy a job because nobody wants to be seen as in cahoots. This is part of sparing dad's honor. He's desperate. It's as bad as it gets. And one day while working with the pigs, he is so hungry. He has no money and no resources. And so he longs to eat the pods, the slop that even the pigs are eating. And it dawns on him, this is bad. This is really bad. You know what I should do? I should go back home and I should say to Dad, I've sinned against heaven, I've sinned against you. If you would just make me like one of your hired servants. I'll spend the rest of my life paying you back. I'll spend the rest of my life paying you off. Here's the problem. He can't make enough money. He'll never be able to pay back the debt. He could get 2 jobs, 3 jobs, 10 jobs. He'll never pay it back. Ever pay it back. Not only that, how do you pay back dishonor? How do you pay back shame? How do you pay back the pain that you've created, the brokenness when you broke your mother's heart for leaving the home? How do you pay it back? There's no price. So I want you to see this. So the son, he wishes his dad was dead. He's insubordinate. He's cruel. He's profoundly wasteful. He loses everything at dad's, and in his desperation, he returns to his father. So here it says in verse 20, he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him, and he ran to his son, and he threw his arms around him, and he kissed him. I know it's gonna sound like I'm beating a dead horse, but don't miss this. What does a sheep do to get found? Nothing. The shepherd went and found the sheep. See, this is really important to understand this story because in your mind, you might rationalize and go, yeah, but maybe the sheep was trying to find its way back home and it got part of the way there, right? It got part of the way and then the shepherd found it part of the way back. Okay, let's make it clearer then. What does a coin do to be found? Well, it could reflect the light in such an angle that maybe she saw it sparkling. Come on. I don't think it's an accident that Jesus switched the story so that it's an inanimate object so that you would know it did nothing. It accepted being found. I think we have this tendency to think that the son has repented and returned home. And if that's the way we view the story, which I'll cover more next week, we miss the real heart of what's going on here. In the same way that the shepherd went and found the coin, in the same way that, the sheep, in the same way that the woman went and found the coin, the shepherd went out and found his lost son. The lost son still thinks he's gonna earn daddy's favor. The son still thinks I just gotta get on the gravy train where dad will take care of me again. He has a completely warped understanding of what it means to be found, to be saved. I don't normally read stories from books. In part, I don't think it makes for great sermons. That's just the reason why. But as I was preparing for this message, I reread parts of a book called What's So Amazing About Grace by Philip Yancey. It's an amazing book. You ought to pick it up someday. But he tells a story in here that I was like, oh, you've got to hear this story. So if you'll give me the grace of a bit of a longer story, I want you to catch some of the details here. Philip Yancey says this: a young girl grows up on a cherry orchard just outside Traverse City, Michigan. Her parents, a bit old-fashioned, tend to overreact to her nose ring, the music she listens to, and the length of her skirts. They ground her a few times, and she seethes inside. I hate you, she screams at her father when he knocks on the door of her room after an argument. That night, she acts on a plan she has mentally rehearsed scores of times. She runs away. She has visited Detroit only once before on a bus trip with her church youth group to watch the Tigers play. Because media in Traverse City report in lurid detail the gangs, the drugs, and the violence in downtown Detroit, she concludes it's probably the last place her parents will look for her. California maybe, or Florida, not Detroit. Her second day there, she meets a man who drives the biggest car she has ever seen. He offers her a ride. He buys her lunch. He arranges a place for her to stay. He gives her some pills that make her feel better than she's ever felt before. She was right all along, she decides. Her parents were keeping her from all the fun. The good life continues for a month, 2 months, a year. The man with the big car, she calls him boss. He teaches her a few things that men like. Since she's underage, men pay a premium for her. She lives in a penthouse and orders room service whenever she wants. Occasionally, she thinks about the folks back home, but their lives now seem so boring and provincial that she can hardly believe she grew up there. She has a brief scare when she sees her picture printed on the back of a milk carton with the headline, "Have you seen this child?" But by now, she has blonde hair, and with all the makeup and body-piercing jewelry she wears, nobody would mistake her for a child. Besides, most of her friends are runaways, and nobody squeals in Detroit. After a year, the first signs of illness appear, and it amazes her how fast the boss turns mean. "These days, we can't mess around," he growls, and before she knows it, she's out on the street without a penny to her name. She still turns a couple of tricks a night, but they don't pay much, and all the money goes to support her habit. When winter blows in, she finds herself sleeping on metal grates outside the big department stores. Sleeping is the wrong word. A teenage girl at night in downtown Detroit can never relax her guard. Dark bands circles her eyes. Her cough worsens. One night, as she lies awake listening for footsteps, all of a sudden, everything about her life looks different. She no longer feels like a woman of the world. She feels like a little girl, lost in a cold and frightening city. She begins to whimper. Her pockets are empty and she's hungry. She needs a fix. She pulls her legs tight underneath her and shivers under the cardboard she's piled atop her coat. Something jolts a synapse of memory and a single image fills her mind. It's May in Traverse City, There's a million cherry trees blooming at once. Her golden retrievers dashing through the rows and rows of blossomy trees in chase of a tennis ball. Oh God, why did I leave? She says to herself, and pain stabs at her heart. My dog back home eats better than I do now. She's sobbing, and she knows in a flash that more than anything else in the world, she just wants to go home. 3 straight phone calls, 3 straight connections with voicemail. She hangs up without leaving a message the first 2 times, but the 3rd time she says, Dad, Mom, it's me. I was wondering about maybe coming home. I'm catching a bus up your way, and I'll get there about midnight tomorrow. If you're not there, well, I guess I'll just stay on the bus until it hits Canada. It takes about 7 hours for a bus to make all the stops between Detroit and Traverse City, and during that time, she realizes the flaws in her plan. What if her parents are out of town or they don't check their voicemail? Shouldn't she have just waited another day or so until she could talk to them? And even if they're home, they probably wrote her off as dead long ago. She should have given them some time to overcome the shock. Her thoughts bounce back and forth between those worries and the speech she's preparing for her father. Oh, Dad, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I know I was wrong. It's not your fault. It's all mine. Dad, can you forgive me? She says the words over and over, her throat tightening even as she rehearses them. She hasn't apologized to anyone in years. The bus has been driving with lights on since Bay City. Tiny snowflakes hit the pavement, rubbed worn by thousands of tires and the asphalt steams. She's forgotten how dark it gets at night out here. A deer darts across the road and the bus kind of swerves. Every so often, a billboard, a sign posting the mileage to Traverse City. When the bus finally rolls into the station, its air breaks, hissing in protest. The driver announces in a crackly voice over the microphone, 15 minutes, folks, that's all we have here. 15 minutes to decide her life. She checks herself in a compact mirror, smooths her hair, licks the lipstick off her teeth. She looks at the tobacco stains on her fingertips and wonders if her parents will notice, if they're there. She walks into the terminal not knowing what to expect. Not one of the 1,000 scenes that have played out in her mind prepare her for what she sees. There, in the concrete walls and plastic chairs of the bus terminal in Traverse City, Michigan, stands a group of 40 people. Brothers and sisters, great aunts and uncles and cousins and grandmothers and great-grandmother to boot. They're all wearing goofy party hats and blowing noisemakers. And taped across the entire wall of the terminal is a homemade banner that reads, "Welcome home." Out of the crowd of well-wishers breaks her dad. She stares out through the tears quivering in her eyes like hot mercury and begins the memorized speech, "Dad, I'm sorry. I know." And he interrupts her. "Hush, child. We got no time for that. No time for apologies. You'll be late for the party. There's a banquet waiting for you at home." It's such a phenomenal modern illustration of what Jesus is trying to tell us. It makes it so real and feelable. When the Father runs out to the Son, he has his rehearsed speech. And if you look at the two, we will next week, the Son is, if you just make me a hired servant, that's his rehearsed speech. When the Father runs to him and he sees the Father's love, he loses that part of his speech. He no longer even attempts to offer to pay back. How in the world could you pay it back? There's nothing he could do to restore what he broke. In this moment, all he can do is accept to be found. And it says in verse 22 that the Father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. This son of mine was dead. He's alive again. He was lost and he's found." So they began to celebrate. I love the way Philip Yancey says this. He says, the notion of God's love coming to us free of charge, no strings attached, seems to go against every instinct of humanity. The Buddhist Eightfold Path, the Hindu doctrine of karma, the Jewish covenant, and the Muslim code of law, each of these offers a way to earn approval. Only Christianity dares to make God's love unconditional. But then we have that other brother we got to talk about. So dad takes the son in, everybody gathers together, the community has come, he's sent out word, everybody gather, we're throwing a party, my son is home. They kill the fattened calf. Now the brother's doing what the brother is supposed to be doing. He's doing what he should have been doing all along. He's out in the field working, he's working hard, but he hears the drums in the distance. As he comes closer, see what would happen in those days is the boys couldn't go into the party, the kids, they would stay outside and they would make up dances and they would play games while enjoying the music. Everybody else is inside. Perhaps he grabs one of these boys and he begins to talk to them and ask the question about what's going on in there. See, dad doesn't need the older son's permission to throw a party. He's still dad. It's still his stuff. But when somebody, one of these boys perhaps, reports to him, your brother is home, instead of being excited that my brother has returned, he's indignant. And he gets angry. And he refuses to go in. I will not celebrate with that brother of mine. Do you know what he's been doing? Do you know what he did to the family name? So he demands that dad come out. So I want you to see this. The older brother, he's faithful, he's obedient, he's hardworking. He always obeys the rules. He always pleases the father. But in his desperation, he rebukes his father. Look at chapter 15, verse 28. It says this, the older brother became angry and refused to go in. So what does the dad do? The father goes out to plead with him. Now you have to understand, what the younger son did was a big deal. He demanded that his own dad die. He shamed the family. He embarrassed dad. He dishonored the name. He broke mom and dad's heart. But the older brother, while he has worked for the family and he's been a good son, nevertheless, he doesn't love the father. He's thinking about himself. Whose fattened calf is in there getting eaten? That's my inheritance you're eating. Whose party is being thrown? I've worked for you. You've never thrown me a party. How dare you do that for him? I have earned your love. I've earned that party. He did nothing. But what does the father do? He goes out and he pleads. Don't you understand? This is my son. Remember, the story began with sinners who are very well aware of what they have done to break the heart of God, and they're coming to Jesus. They're very attracted to Jesus. And the religious elite, the ones who obey, they're like, how dare you? And so Jesus tells them one parable. There's a lost sheep, and the shepherd goes, I can't go with even one who's lost. I gotta go find him. There's a lost coin, and the woman goes, I must have my coin. It means too much to me. There's a lost son, and he still thinks he's gonna earn his way back. He's gonna find his way to heaven. And the father goes out and finds him and says, my son. And then there's another lost son. And the problem is that second lost son doesn't think he's lost. The second lost son thinks he's got it all together. He thinks he's put all the pieces together because I've worked hard and I've been faithful all these years. He owes me one. But the way Jesus tells the story, the father goes out to try to win him and save him just as much as the younger brother. I love the way Tim Keller says this. He says, neither son loved the father for himself. They were both using the father for their own self-centered ends rather than loving, enjoying, and serving him for his own sake. This means that you can rebel against God and be alienated from him either by breaking his rules or by keeping all of them diligently. And see, that blows some of our minds. Because remember where I started? We've all got a group of people that we think Jesus wouldn't spend time with those people. But what Jesus is doing in the story is he's saying, we're all those people. We are all sinners desperately in need of grace. But the way that Jesus tells the story in Luke 15, it ends without any resolution. I know I'm being redundant, but the sheep got found, party. The coin got found, party. The younger son got found, party. The older son, he was offered the invitation into the party, and Luke 15 ends, and we go right into Luke 16, and we don't know if he went into the party. It's like playing a song and leaving the very last note off, and you want to run up to the piano and go, what are you doing? You can't not play the last note, but Jesus leaves it open on purpose because he wants you to consider, what about you? Will you come into the party? Will you accept the free grace that is found in Jesus Christ and come in? All of heaven is waiting to rejoice, waiting to throw a party over just one sinner who repents. Will you come in to the party? The only way to make it into the party is to humble yourself like a little child and say, I can't fix this on my own. I'm not good enough on my own. Jesus and only Jesus. So I don't know where this lands right now. I have this sneaky suspicion in this room there are some prodigal younger brothers. You've done things you know you weren't supposed to do, and you carry this constant shame and pain, and maybe to yourself, you wonder, like the girl in the story, you wonder, if I were to come home, what would people really say? What would they really think? Would they accept me? Would they love me? Would they care? But there are also perhaps some older brothers and sisters in this room as well who think because they've had it all together that maybe, just maybe, they don't need the same grace that the younger brother needs. What I want to do right now is I want to give you a moment to just sit with God, but praying for you all morning, that God would stir and move in your heart and reveal to you what he's calling you to. And so we've got a song that we're going to sing, and I just want you to let these words wash over you. And listen, if you know exactly God is speaking to you so loudly right now, then I just want you to spend this time talking to him. Get some things out. Come home. Repent to him. Talk to him. Accept his love and mercy and grace, but don't just do nothing. I'm going to start a prayer, and I'm just going to leave you in that place, and they're going to sing over you. Let's pray. My Lord and God, here's my prayer. It's going to be really simple, God. The big problem here, Father, is our pride. For both kinds of brothers and sisters, it's our pride. So God, for those of us who look more like the younger brother, our pride keeps us from coming home, admitting we were wrong, admitting that we have sinned, and saying we need help. And God, the son in the story clearly hit rock bottom, but God, some of us, rock bottom is so far away, it's terrifying. Lord, my prayer right now is that you would help break through the pride that keeps us from reaching out and saying, I need Jesus. I need help. I can't do this on my own. I need grace. And God, I pray right now you would draw all men and women to yourself. But Lord, I pray also for the older brothers and the older sisters in this room who think because they've been good, that they're good enough. God, show us for a moment our sin. God, show us our own hearts that fail us and turn away from you and are hardened against you and sometimes harsh and mean and judgmental of younger brothers. God, help us to remember how desperately we need you. And God, break our pride. Break our pride that keeps us convinced that we are good enough because of some good things that we've done. And instead, let us fall on the mercy seat of Jesus. Lord, I pray you would do something in this room that can't be explained by sermon or by song, but only by Spirit. We ask this in Jesus' name.